Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our virtual talk for March for MIT alumni in Australia. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Jonathan Gibbs, who has been a very active member of our community here in Australia for the past at least 2 years, maybe 3 years, Jonathan. It's been wonderful seeing you at nearly all of our events, both online and in person. Jonathan is going to be talking to us today about disruptive innovations in commercial aviation. And it's something that he has been thinking about for a long time. And I'm sure he'll tell you more about his experience during this talk. Jonathan started his interest, maybe it was even before then, but I know that he has both a bachelor's degree and a Master of Science degree from MIT in Aeronautics and Astronautics, and started thinking about innovation when he was a student at MIT back in 2011, when he actually founded Savion, if I've got that right, as part of the MIT Clean Energy event. So that was really exciting. Since MIT, he's gotten some broad experience working in aviation, both for some traditional organizations like Boeing and also for some very innovative institutes like the MIT Lab for Aviation and the Environment and the German Aerospace Center's Institute of Air Transport Systems. And he has gotten a lot of experience with his startup company and thinking about these sorts of things. So, Jonathan, I'm sure you'll explain a bit more deeply about your experience during the talk, but I'm very pleased to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Evelyn, for your introduction and all the work that you do in putting all this together. So I'll just jump in. Just a quick agenda of what we'll go through. So I'll just Evelyn did a great job of explaining my background. I'll just touch on a couple things. Then before we talk about the actual disruptive innovation of the jet engine, we'll talk about just what a disruptive innovation actually is. And I'll have a separate non-aviation based case study. And I'll ask you guys some questions. And then we'll jump into the jet engine. And then we'll see if we can use the same strategy, the disruptive strategy for the energy transition. And then at the end, if we have time, I have made disruption jeopardy, which isn't necessarily a trivia thing, but just over my time, I've done a lot of case studies and tried to apply the strategy to different problems. And so I just compiled some slides. So there's about 4 of them, four case studies, and we'll just let you guys pick which one you might be interested in. You can guess what the strategy is, and you can kind of see what happened when we tested certain things. So with that, so just as everyone said, my background, went to MIT in 2006, went to Boeing, then came back to MIT to get my master's in 2011. I got interested in energy because at that time the energy prices were spiking, and anyways, that was the hippie thing to do at the time. So after finishing my master's, I joined the MIT Laboratory of Aviation and Environment. So that's around the time that the clean energy prize happened. And at least you're forced to start a company if you go beyond a certain round. And we were starting with LNG because one, there was an abundance of LNG due to shale drilling, and that made the prices fall. And the prices were about half the cost of jet fuel. And it's also a bit greener than jet fuel, so about 20% less carbon. And so if you're half the cost and less carbon, we thought there was a really great arbitrage business opportunity there to convert aircraft over. In contrast, sustainable aviation fuel is about 3 times more expensive. And if you do a 10% blend, you get half of the carbon reduction. So somehow a fossil fuel ended up being better than a blend of synthetic fuel. But anyways, that's why we started the company. It was dormant for a long time. So I moved to Germany to work on this some more. And then we came back and got VC backing to do the aircraft, the 2-passenger remotely piloted LNG aircraft. The pictures there is after we got our VC backing, we actually test flew an LNG plane. So it was with cryogenic fuel. Cryogenic fuel is just like liquid hydrogen. It's very, very cold. So anyways, we figured this out with the help of a couple of partners, and we were the first to do this in the US. And then we moved to Melbourne in 2022, in part because we had a business plan around working with the LNG export industry to sort of ship aircraft over. So that's how I got here. And that's a bit about my background. So let's just talk a little bit about just what disruptive innovation is. And I should say, I learned about this because my roommate was a Sloan Fellow, and she had Clay Christensen, who's the originator of this theory, come to MIT and give a series of talks. So I took 15, 9, 12 after that, and then I used my project to do commercial aviation, and this is where a lot of this content comes from. Turned out to be a very large rabbit hole I'm still in. So anyways, on the we just graph this in terms of adoption and time. So disruptive innovations, they're attractive because they rapidly gain market share and adoption, meaning people will adopt that product in a very short period of time. So if you think about the energy transition, we've got a limited amount of time. So something that might gain adoption quickly would be attractive, or a strategy that might do that. So on the left is in the black is just a conventional innovation. We just graphing its adoption rate over time, right? So it typically starts out kind of flat, then it starts to grow, and then it sort of tapers off where at a point where it's a mature design. The disruptive metric typically starts at the end of that maturity, the green one, and it typically is not as good as the old one, and it's in the what we call the basis of competition. So the performance metrics that typically you really care about at that time that made that particular product strong. But it is really good at a new metric that some what we call non-consumers or non-consumption market cares about. So the early customers tend to be people who are not using the existing product. They might be doing something else, or they may not just think it's worth it to use it. So the new people start to use this product. And in the middle part, you rapidly gain market share because as the new people start to use the product, you have enough revenue and you start improving upon the things that the old product does well. And you get to a point where you're quote unquote good enough. And then what happens is you have become the dominant player because you have that new market of people who weren't consuming. And then you have enough of the old market where now you're the new player, right? And then you would say this product disrupted this industry, or this product disrupted this other product. And the innovator's dilemma, which is the title of one of the books that Christensen wrote, the dilemma is about the incumbents. And if you're an incumbent and you see this happening, what do you do about it? Do you compete? Do you try to change your product that might, make your existing customers upset because it's not going to be as good as it was and as much that they cared about? Do you make a copycat product? What do you actually do? So the Innovator's Dilemma is a book about how companies should respond to disruptive innovations. And a lot of the I guess, current thought is you should have a VC firm and make your own, disrupt yourself, right? And so you see a lot of companies like GM and GE have GM Ventures and GE Ventures, and maybe your company might have a venture farm. And some of that comes from this kind of thought theory. So the last thing that Christensen did, I think, was he sort of just measured the success rate, right? And I think as academic people, we tend to think these theories are right or wrong. But in the business world, it's a social science, right? So it's probabilistic. Some things sometimes work, sometimes they don't. So by his metrics, and he studied disk drives, construction, all kinds of industries, he thinks if you try a disruptive strategy, this becoming dominant happens about a third of the time, right? So it's not a foolproof. If you do something disruptive, you will succeed. But a third of the time is really great. And if you don't do a disruptive strategy, if you just kind of stick to your guns as an incumbent, you're right about 6% of the time. So if you take those two in aggregate, you're probably better off trying something disruptive, and at least you're going to have a much better chance of surviving whatever ends up happening. So I thought I'd do a fun example in fitness. Some of you may have heard of SoulCycle. I think all of us would have heard of Peloton. And this is a classic case of disruption where Peloton eventually disrupted SoulCycle. So let me just ask you guys, if you are a SoulCycle user, what do you think SoulCycle did really well relative to other gyms or gym classes? That's the basis, and we call it whatever this is, that's the basis of competition. Has anybody ever used SoulCycle, by the way? If not, I'll volunteer. Go ahead.
It's been a long time, Jonathan, but I think they provided a sense of community and accountability that was really nice, as opposed to just cycling by yourself at the gym, and encouraged people who maybe traditionally wouldn't be into that type of exercise and gave them a community. That's what I remember from years ago.
And I see one in your background too, so maybe you're also a Peloton.
That is a very inexpensive bicycle, but yes, that is not what they have. That's just me by myself.
You've disrupted Peloton, right? So, okay.
Anybody else? I should get a Peloton. You can talk to my husband.
Okay. So anybody else okay, so really the sense of community and is what SoulCycle did really well relative to other spinning classes. So anybody who has a Peloton, any thought besides working at home, which is a big improvement, what were they good at that maybe caused some people who weren't doing SoulCycle to actually start cycling and start doing spin classes? Any thoughts? Okay, I'll give my thoughts. So I agree with Evelyn that SoulCycle did a really good job of cultivating community. Um, and they really had great instructors that were dynamic and made it fun. And you might have pushed yourself more in those workouts than if you were just working out by yourself. Um, the problem with SoulCycle, at least the Peloton founder found, was that you had to sign up really quickly for the class because they were so popular. So you had to wake up at a certain time to sign up for a class later that day or later that week. And then, but they also had a very low upfront cost, right? So Peloton is expensive. You have to buy the bike, right? A couple $1,000s, but you can work out from home. So people who weren't able to get to a class may have started Peloton. And that was that people of non-consumption who were not particularly earlier doing SoulCycle. In terms of the community, if you look at this screen, you see the instructor, but you see on the right there, you can see everyone in the class and how their heart rate and how much they're pushing. And I did a couple of classes recently, and the instructor actually talks to you. Like he'll say your screen name and say, "Great job. Try to catch this other person because I can see you're almost there, right?" So it's maybe not as good as being in person and talking to your friends after the class is over, but you can get this sort of sense of community from this technology of having the screen on the bike, and you can see your own stats. And then recently, well, maybe not recently, but a lot of those instructors went online with Instagram, right? So you can also text them and connect with them, and they do videos. So they've sort of gotten the community to be good enough, right? And so let's see what happened. What was SoulCycle's dilemma? If you listen to the Peloton founder talk, he actually tried to get SoulCycle to tape their classes and put them on Peloton. This was his original idea. He just wanted to make the bicycle with the tablet. And SoulCycle said, why should we do that? People come to our classes and they pay a lot of money. If we did that, no one would come to our classes anymore. So this was the SoulCycle, the classic innovator's dilemma. So ultimately, SoulCycle declined to tape their classes. One of the spinoffs, Flywheel, did assist Peloton. And let's just say, safe to say that neither of them were successful. They were in that 6% or in that 94% that didn't succeed in countering disruptive innovation. So a lot of people might think it was the pandemic that caused people to switch to Peloton. But if you look at the graph, it was actually in 2018 where you see Peloton start to overtake SoulCycle in terms of the active members, right? And again, this is the people who weren't at home or didn't have time to go to a class that started going. And then when the people who were going to SoulCycle classes discovered Peloton, they said, "Oh, it's good enough at the community part, and now I don't have to commute," right? So they started buying bikes. And then it was too late for SoulCycle to do anything, right? They started taking their own classes. They partnered with Equinox, but right now, I think Peloton's revenue is about 4 times that of SoulCycle's, right? So that's just a clear of when the basis of competition, what it was, community. Someone had something better, which is maybe I don't have to commute, right? It's maybe hard to quantify that. And then over time, the disruptive innovation route wins. It becomes a dominant layer. So again, can we do this? Can we quantify this? And can we do this in the energy transition? So for my project in 15912, I started looking at the commercial aircraft industry. And sure enough, the same pattern occurred, but I started to quantify everything. And then what I found interestingly enough is that it wasn't the difference in performance that mattered. It was actually the difference in performance over time that mattered, right? So let's look at since we're in Australia, we'll do Qantas. So Qantas had a propeller aircraft called the Constellation. You might remember it from the movie The Aviator. It was the de facto long haul plane for traveling long distances. Some of you might have done this on the Kangaroo route. And then the jet age happened in about 1958. So obviously the jets went faster. That was a disruptive metric. The range, energy efficiency, and flexibility, those were all the things that the Lockheed Constellation was the best at. And to be clear, the 707 was actually a little bit worse. So being disruptive doesn't mean you're just better at everything. It means you're better at one thing, and you're probably a little bit worse at these other things, right? So it didn't fly as far as a Constellation did. It was less fuel efficient, meaning it cost more per ticket. And flexibility, we do that as the inverse of the passenger count, right? So business travelers typically want to have multiple choices of flights, right? So if you have one big airplane that flies once a day, and you compete against somebody that has many airplanes, small airplanes that fly many times per day, the business travelers would tend to pick the smaller ones because they have more choices. So we just do 1 over the number of seats as a flexibility measure, right? So you could theoretically have one more extra flight for the same number of people per day if you had the proper propeller. But nevertheless, Within 1 year of the 707 entering service, production of the propeller stopped, right? Like 1 year. Imagine if that happened with fossil fuels. So it's safe to say that the jet engine and maybe on the platform of the 707 was unquestionably disruptive. So what happens next is, the jet engine starts to improve in these other things, to, as it and gets those new people, right? And then in terms of non-consumption, people who maybe it took too long to get somewhere, maybe they weren't flying, but now because it's faster, they decide we're going to go, right? So sometimes it's the same market of people, but if you ever watch Southwest, they say want to get away this weekend. It's like it's so cheap that you could just go, right? That's the example I like to think of is going after non-consumption. So you're not competing with someone who's already a passenger on, let's say, Virgin. You're competing with someone who's staying at home. You're competing with not doing anything. So the next big innovation was the high bypass engine, and we saw this on the 747. It still improved a little bit on speed, but it definitely improved on range, right? So this is the first trans-Pacific aircraft. For those of us from America, I mean, you can go to the West Coast all the way to Asia, China, Japan, etc., without stopping in Hawaii first. So this is a huge time savings. The energy efficiency got better. So when the energy efficiency got better, the new market was the middle class, right? Huge new market of people who were going to start buying. The Bond movies of the 60s, it was about traveling because people couldn't afford to travel. So they would go to the Bond movies to see what it was like to travel somewhere. But now as students, we can fly from Australia to MIT and go to school and fly back as students. And it's no big deal, right? So the energy efficiency improvement was the biggest deal there. Flexibility got worse, right? So 707 has about 100 seats, a little more than 100, I think. The 747 has 400 seats, close to that amount, right? So you've got to have one big flight for everybody. And but it was, again, the only way to go these long distances without stopping. So in some cases with KLM, they would put cargo in the back half of it. They didn't have enough people, right? This is sort of improving upon the existing metrics. And of course, we're pretty much done with propellers at this point for long range travel. So why not keep doing that? Let's go even faster. Let's go to the Concorde. So the Concorde went even faster than the 747. It was more than twice as fast, right? And it restored the flexibility of the 707 because there's only 100 seats. And so the problem was the energy efficiency was so bad. It was so bad that no one could actually afford. Very few people could afford to use it. And even when those people who paid the premiums, all the 747s were sold for £1, right? Literally $1, because the cost of running them was so high that the airlines couldn't make any money on them if they had to actually pay for the aircraft themselves, right? So this is what we call going beyond the disruptive threshold or the threshold of good enough, meaning you were so bad at something that even the disruptive part of what you were good at wasn't enough to overcome that. So this is when that 70% of ideas or 65% that sort of you try something disruptive, but it doesn't quite work, right? And again, it's not an exact science like we would like it to be in academia, but what we try to do is try to figure out what are those thresholds. You can be a little bit worse, but not that much worse. Then what ended up happening was the 767 came out, right? It was actually a little bit slower, so it actually got worse. And you might say the 747 became the dominant design. That made the basic competition. So you can even say the 767 was disrupted to the 747 in that its flexibility got better. So now for the same, fuel price ticket price, you could fly twice, have 2 flights per day instead of just one. Because the 767 is about half the capacity of the 747. It also had supercritical wings, which improved fuel efficiency. So you didn't have to have 400 seats to be able to make the cost low. And now pretty much every long haul plane today looks a lot like the 767. So that's sort of the life cycle of the disruptive innovation. You have a disruptive venture that gets a new set of people, then you improve upon the other ones, and then the aggregate of that is what lets you dominate. So I like to look at this in aggregate just to see what happened, right? So if we start over on the left, the Constellation was doing great. Everyone who wanted to fly across the ocean would get on the Constellation or one of the competitors, but it was the best, it was the market leader. But the 707, despite having a higher fuel cost and a higher ticket price, definitely, looks like almost doubled the market size. So this is measuring the number of seats of the plane sold, right? So if every plane has 200 seats, multiply that number of planes times 200, right? So that's why you can compare planes with different sizes. in terms of their market share. The 747, it was the first one to be able to go trans-Pacific distances without stopping, and there was no competitor for 9 years, right? So, so that's why it has such a huge adoption curve. So the people, but I think at Boeing and a lot of and Airbus as well, they knew it was too big for a lot of markets. So that's when you start to see these smaller twin-engine ones come about. The 767, the 777 sort of replaced the old 747s, and then you might see in the modern times here the 787 and the A380, right? So the A380 was again too big. It was classic kind of they just you improve upon fuel efficiency, but you sort of got worse at something else, maybe flexibility, right? Until the 787, you could fly more flights per day for the same number of aggregate demand, and people wanted that choice, and those new thin routes. So let me just pause here and see if you guys have any questions and if you grasp the theory and how it sort of applied. Then we'll kind of get to what can we do about the energy transition.
Jonathan, I was just wondering if you can explain how this graph works a little bit more. So the cumulative number of seats sold, is that normalized over a certain number of years, or is that for a single year?
Yeah, so to visualize, so these actually have curves in terms of number. So if you just multiply number of planes times number of seat per plane, these planes, they make them in slightly different lengths. So one airline might want a longer one, another airline might want a shorter one. So I just multiplied that to get a bullet point, or data point. It's just the number of seats that were sold over the lifetime of the plane at the time it was and we put that at the time it was introduced. Otherwise, there'd be a bunch of curves all over the place, and they would overlap, and it'd be hard to sort of see, which sold more or less. Oh, Roger's got his hand up.
Yeah, so one of the things I've found useful, and you may have done this in terms of looking at disruption, is the messaging that competitors use relative to one another. And I'm wondering if you've actually looked at sort of the presentation or doing blue ocean canvases for these. Because what you're effectively saying in each of those steps is that you've got a new entrant, emphasizing one set of features or capabilities or, the ability to create value, distinct from the predecessor.
I haven't. It's a really good question. A lot of the sales presentations to airlines are private, or they're confidential, as are like the airline prices. In defense, you do see this a lot. So even at the air show, you can see that, even though we don't, as people, buy fighter jets or whatever, you'll see Lockheed say, keeps you safe, right? No one can see it coming. I was there yesterday and it said, you can shoot someone before they see you, right? And, if you think of stealth and speed and all these other things for fighter jets, they do message that way. I think that the thing I would say that broadly applies is that the metric changes, right? And we build a business, and we want to be good at that thing, and we don't like changing that thing that we spent so hard to be good at. But to stay in business, to stay competitive, you have to be able to adapt to improve upon the next thing that someone else cares about. And the other thing that's important is to realize that the thing that when you have a new entrant that comes in, they're not necessarily going after your best customers. They're going after a new set of people who weren't using your product. And so, yeah, but I would say, the main thing is that the goalpost is always changing. And
yeah, but that's the thing, and that's one of the useful things about that particular tool is that it has an extreme focus on what the customer values, and the customer may be different.
Right. The customer changes, so they value something different, and then, I completely agree. It's inexact as well, which is frustrating, and but hopefully, and not everyone gets it right. The Concorde did really poorly. That company, the remnants of it became Airbus as we now know it, and now Airbus. This ends in 2010 when I made this graph. Right, if you forward out now, like these would all be higher, except in the short haul with the Airbus 320 taking over the 737, and that one got long enough to be able to do transatlantic routes. So now you don't have to have a 767 or an A330 to fly across the Atlantic, and now you see JetBlue and even Qantas is now using these planes on these longer routes, and that disrupted the wide body products. So I would say one just last thing here. I think Qantas did a magnificent job of figuring out this dilemma when they started Jetstar, right? So, but it's Jetstar. It's in a different value chain. It's got its own pricing, its own supply chain, but it successfully fended off all the other low cost carriers and So I would say Qantas with Jetstar definitely successfully navigated the innovator's dilemma. Um, and maybe we have less competition because of that in Australia for flights, but that's an example of someone doing a masterful job of that. So, okay, let's continue on to the let's see, how are we on time? I think I'll just get to what is a business model that could work.
We've got 30 minutes left, Jonathan, so it just
Oh,
depends.
okay, it's not a half hour. All of my meetings are half an hour.
One for questions. Yeah.
All right, I think we're good then. All right, so my sort of research / startup journey is going to be about, can we use this strategy to sort of fix the energy transition? Is there some disruptive thing I can come up with? Can I actually figure out what it needs to look like in terms of its performance, and then back out what the design is from its performance to sort of get this to work, right? So let me just start with the problem. And this isn't true for just hydrogen, it's for everything here. So the green thing that you want to be green is probably going to be more expensive. It's going to be heavier, and it's going to take up more space. That's just sort of, if you're flying a plane, you need to be lightweight. So you pick the lightest thing you could find, which was jet fuel at the time that plane started going. So 50 years before Wilbur and Orr flew their plane, petroleum was discovered. Discovery is sort of a weird word, but in 1850 we found petroleum, and then 50 years later or so, you see the first flights happening, right? The physics for knowing how to fly was actually known well before that time, but there wasn't an energy source that would work, right? So I think Brazil, grew up on most of their vehicles are like natural gas, right? Because when they kind of industrialized, natural gas was what was available. So we picked jet fuel for a good reason. And so it's very hard for something something else to sort of beat it. So these aren't my numbers on the left for hydrogen. This is from the Future Fuels CRC. But they basically said there's no physics-based pathway. There's no sensitivity case of improvement of electrolyzers and electricity prices, et cetera, where you're going to get to the $2 kilogram target. So on that graph for hydrogen, you see most of the cost, $5 of it is behind the meter electricity. So behind the meter means you built your own solar panel and then you hooked yourself up. So when you buy your electricity from the grid, if you see what the prices breakdown is, about 80% of it's the distribution cost, and 25% of it's like the actual wholesale cost, right? So when you sell your solar back, you get the wholesale cost back, right? So if you did a wholesale electricity with yourself, this is what the hydrogen would cost. So Roger's got a question. Oh, I think you're muted. I think you're muted, Roger. Oh.
Roger, you're on mute.
I can hear. I know I'm on it. What if you were to use the high SATA 95% efficient electrolyzer, this company out of Hong Kong, and then use it at the time when there's an excess of energy, the energy markets push the price negative? Could you make the orange bar there for electricity zero?
Yeah, so that's an example of a disruptive business model. So high SATA, when they say 95% efficient, they mean 95% of the theoretical efficiency. So that means electrolysis is still 25% efficient. So you might go from 450 to 420 with that, which still is something, but you're already past $2, right? Which is where you need to be. So I think this really needs to be $1 a kilogram as a target. But if you see SAF, SAF is a little bit cheaper than that. But what a lot of the hydrogen people will say is there's no maintenance. But if we factor in the jet engine maintenance, this green bar, you're still cheaper than this green hydrogen, right? And then typically the cost of the electrolyzer, well, maybe they want more money for it because it's more efficient. So you sort of most people end up in the $10, $50 kilogram category for liquid hydrogen for what you need for aircraft. But yeah, the point is, if you're at 95% efficient, the physics is already settled, it's mature, right? And you need a business model to sort of do this. So one of them is definitely, you just turn on the electrolyzer when the electricity prices are negative, right? Now, of course, the utility is not going to sell you negative electricity prices. So the utility has to do this. There's been a deal like this in Europe. I think it's in Germany, where the utility decide they're going to start making hydrogen and selling it. But here, this happened. Fortescue did this famously, and then they tried to use the hydrogen to make steel or what have you. But the problem was when they got $3 a kilogram hydrogen, which is what you get when you sort of do everything optimally for that, they couldn't find someone who wanted to buy the steel for that price that would use that as an input cost, because they're used to buying natural gas made steel, which is over here, which is still less than $2. So So it's not the technical ability for hydrogen to work, and which is we tend to focus on. It's what's the price point at which it does work, right? And so
Jonathan,
to
just one more
yeah,
comment on that. This is not nearly as mature as other ways of making hydrogen, but there has been a lot of discussion. In fact, I think there's even a workshop this week in the US at the Energy Futures Initiative on this. The idea of finding natural hydrogen
yeah,
gas, which you can find in
yeah,
certain places.
yeah.
And I don't know what the costs are associated with
No,
that.
no,
And
no.
of course, there's
I
going
think
to be
this
geopolitical
it's
influence on
it's
that, but it's interesting to think about that.
it's great you brought this up because it contextualizes what my point is that this has gotten so bad. We're so far away from anywhere close to this working as with electrolysis that we're now looking to dig up hydrogen like we dig up oil, right?
Yep.
so, so there's two startups that are doing
We're
this,
good
and
at
one of them,
digging things up out of the ground, but
yeah, yeah.
anyway, I can talk to you about the geology of that if you want some time, but I'll let you
We
get on with
you
your
should
talk.
totally do a talk. No, yeah. So I think that's great, and it totally illustrates the point here of the talk, right? So that's what I will say about that is that at least one of the companies has come out and said they think this is a good enough for about a third of the hydrogen demand is what you can get geologically. So you're still going to have 2/3 that you need to do, and then even with SAF, there's only but so much biologic feedstock. So they think they're going to have to make SAF from hydrogen as well. So it's not to say this isn't about altruism and being a good person. Like you just have to actually do the math and find a way to meet the same replace. If you're going to get rid of fossil fuels, you got to replace the energy, you got to replace the revenue, right? And keep the cost base the same. So I've tried to explain this in many different ways, but I think the best one I've said is the airlines would need a 60% profit margin to actually start using this stuff. And typically the average, according to IATA, the average profit margin of an airline is like 1.5%. And a good year cost is like around 10 or 15%, right? But most airlines are close to, if not profitable at all. So this is a perfect situation where we're going to try to use disruption to replace fossil fuels and compete on something different, and then see if we can be good enough on the other things. So one idea is to use battery electric aircraft. So that's fine. Do a flight with a smaller battery electric aircraft. But while the aircraft is parked, you use the aircraft as a grid battery. So a lot of, I think the plight of Rex and Sharp and a lot of the regional aviation in Australia, there's just not enough demand to sustain scheduled airline travel more than once a day, if that. And Rex is doing its best with 30-seat aircraft, which are no longer in production because there's no one else that needs them. And they're flying once a day, right? So they could just get to a lot of their routes, right? So what we're saying here is why don't you park the aircraft at the airport, use it as a grid battery, and then you do that one flight a day. So if one flight a day and coming back takes 4 hours, you have 20 hours where you can potentially recharge and then give some energy back to the grid. And then you can get revenue, importantly, as a grid battery. So we tried this, did some math and just to see what would happen. And what we found was the new market should actually be the infrastructure investors, not the airlines, not the passengers. So if an infrastructure investor is going to be building airport solar farms, like there is at Brisbane coming up, I think soon, they would get a 10% rate of return of investment. But if they combine that with a battery powered aircraft rather than building a grid battery, the flight revenue from that very short period of time, so the flight revenue per hour is very, very high for flights, right? So the time that you're flying, you get a lot of money versus what you get for, doing electricity functions, right? So for 17% of the flying, you get, almost 3 times, a little more than 2.5 times the revenue that you get from being a grid storage device, right? So if you combine that revenue together, you actually, so you get about the same if you do the 4 hours per day, but if you get up to a third of the day operating, you can get you reduce your electricity, function, you can get about 14% rate of return. So what we've been telling the infrastructure investors is that we would give you a higher rate of return on your infrastructure investment. And we need them to classify the plane as infrastructure. So, and we say, yeah, the plane's not doing anything most of the day. So it's infrastructure. It's doing a grid function most of the day. So it's why would you buy a grid battery but not buy this? So it's a little bit of an iffy argument, but it's the argument we've been trying to make for a battery electric plane. So the plane here that you see in the picture is called the Aviation Alice. It was the engines for a company called Magnus that started in Queensland. It's now in Seattle. So anyway, this is our idea for a potential disruptive business model, right? Nothing with the physics changed. It's just using the business model to get a second source of revenue to make the business case work. This is just a diagram of how it would work. Again, the electricity goes to instead of a grid battery, goes to the aircraft. You can recharge. Then you give the energy back to the grid, or you fly. The range is short, so it's not going to get you across an ocean, but it would provide service to a lot of the regional areas for the distance that they have to fly, right? So next question is, can you do this for hydrogen? So we came up with the one for hydrogen, where instead of a battery, it's an electrolyzer on the plane. And same idea, right? You have to have some water at the airport, but hydrogen's a little bit trickier to deal with. So we're doing a remotely piloted plane, kind of our old LNG plane, but with hydrogen, right? So it's a remotely operated, that's coming to Australia in 2032 with Whisk. So automated passenger flights is already on its way anyway. And again, if you're a charter flight, you're probably flying again once or twice a day. You're on the ground most of the time. So if you can make hydrogen, you could potentially use your aircraft to get additional revenue. And now the green aircraft is returning more capital than the fossil-based aircraft. And that hydrogen can be sold for e-fuels. It can be used to make green steel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So same idea here. Solar and water goes to the plane. You get hydrogen off. You put it to wherever you're going to use it at, and then you still fly. But you get quite a bit more range this time. So 800 kilometers. So this is about Melbourne to Sydney, which is the most important route, as you guys know. So think about what would you guys get on a zero emissions plane at Melbourne to Sydney, and you would leave from Moorabbin maybe and not have to go all the way to Tullamarine or wherever is closest to you. And we would just park those planes there, and they're going to make hydrogen until somebody wants to go. So it operates more like an Uber than on a schedule. So we looked at the pricing, and it's not cheaper. It's about the same as a Rex flight. And we did a sample. I'm not saying Rex is bad, but we did a sample. Rex was actually a little bit cheaper than QantasLink, so we used Rex as a proxy. But Rex is also in administration. So could this be a way to replace the fossil planes at Rex, which are going to expire anyway, because these planes are pressurized, so their lifetime is, they don't have much longer. So same thing with Sharp Airlines. They've got really old, 19 seats to go to Tassie, right? So this is an idea. So again, it's about 65 cents to $1 per kilometer, which is, if you use all SAF on a Rex plane, that would be about close to that. And if you drove somewhere for your job and you got to get reimbursed, the ATO says you get 88 cents a kilometer. So we're cheaper than driving. And then the VTOLs, the best VTOL, my favorite one, Whisk from Boeing, it's autonomous as well. So that's the one that's coming to Brisbane for the Olympics in 2032. It costs about $280 per person, right? And that's per person. So this plane is for the whole plane, right? So those VTOLs are going to be probably a luxury item to start with. They're going to be more than the cost of driving. But this one can be less than the cost of driving, not because its physics are any better, or fixed wing is better, but because you have a second revenue stream, right? So we tried this, and of course, we had the same problem as Fortescue. Nobody wanted to buy the hydrogen from what we thought it would for $3 a kilogram or whatever we were going to charge. So then we tried to figure out what would happen if we subsidized the hydrogen with the flights. And we just said, we're going to give you hydrogen for $1 a kilogram. And we're going to just use the flight profits to subsidize you. And then we start to get somewhere, right? So now the return on investments, even on the 4 hours of flying, is 14%. So that's still higher than just a solar farm, right? We don't have to wait for permitting, because if you certify a plane one time, you can fly pretty much anywhere you're certified, right? But every new hydrogen project needs a whole set of permitting and all final investment decision, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not more efficient than a stationary hydrogen farm, but it is faster to deploy. And it should be, because you have this flight revenue, which is very lucrative, you can subsidize the hydrogen to a point where now a company like Linfox can drive its trucks around on hydrogen without needing subsidies from the government, right? Because it's subsidized by the market, not by the government. And maybe that now then works in other places that are countries that aren't rich enough to subsidize energy production. And for us, we also love to export, steel, right? So green steel at $3 a kilogram hydrogen, green steel didn't work out for Australia, but at $1 a kilogram hydrogen, it might work, right? So we're trying to receive Whyalla. Well, it might be too late for that, but you can kind of start to see how using a different business model can give you a low cost of hydrogen without the government having to subsidize everything. And then that can now scale outside of Australia and become a successful startup, right? And then if you're returning more capital than a fossil-based asset, you might see somebody say, hey, well, I'd rather have that green aircraft rather than that fossil-based one. They're not going to be forced to do so. So that's sort of the disruptive talk. Here's disruptive jeopardy, but let me just stop there and see if you guys have questions. And there's I mean, I should also say there's open questions about that model, like how much hydrogen can you really make? There's safety questions. So, but we're just starting on paper to see, could a business model work, right? And then we would say, okay, if it works, let's see, can we make components that are designed to be compact enough for an aircraft? So, okay, but yeah, with that, please jump in with any questions or let me know which of the Jeopardy categories you want to try.
I've got a question about your business model for your company and just for alternative aviation or disruptive aviation in general. So aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries. And traditionally, when you're decarbonizing something for a while, it's legitimate to claim carbon avoidance credits, which can basically put you on a level playing field. You know, in the past, it was justifiable to do this with renewable energy. Now it's not because the price has fallen and there's a legitimate business model. Is that something that you've explored as part of your business case?
Yeah. So that's Jeopardy question number 4.
Oh, I picked a Jeopardy question. I didn't even know it.
If there's any other questions, I'll jump into that. But that's actually a product that we've launched.
Okay, well, let's see what other questions we have, and then perhaps we can go to that one. Great. Does anyone else have a question? Feel free to raise your hand or just turn your microphone off. I muted everybody during the call and just ask your question.
Okay. All right. So Evelyn gets the first Jeopardy question. So zero emissions flight credits. Can these disrupt the carbon offset industry? All right. So here we go. So first, what is a zero emissions flight credit? So it's a flight credit similar to an airline point. The first thing is that it's distance based. So with your airline points, it's based, or your flybys. Do you guys use flybys points, or you guys use everyday rewards or Qantas points? One of the, you know, those effectively function as a currency, right? And the airline can value them. So every time Qantas says we're going to make you need more points to fly somewhere, everyone gets mad, and it works like a currency. And a zero emissions flight credit, well, a carbon offset is you have to displace X amount of carbon, a ton of carbon. And a flight credit with zero emissions flying is the same principle. You have to fly a kilometer. So you can make them worth more or less in terms of dollars, but they have to all be redeemable for a flight of a kilometer or 1 kilometer flying on a zero emissions vehicle. So we broke this down what it would actually cost in terms of the infrastructure, the operational costs. You get a big savings from autonomous software. So we're big purveyors of, or big fans of autonomous flying and things like that nature, because you can make this work. The vehicle costs and then the overhead costs and of course the audit, right? So one of the big problems with the offset industry was, could you audit? Did someone really plant that tree? How long after they planted that tree did it take to get rid of my driving carbon CO2? Was it 50 years? Was it 100 years? How long did it really take? So but with a flight credit, you can actually see on the radar how far you flew. So the audit is automated, right? You can monitor how much hydrogen you produce. You can monitor how much solar you made. So you can get rid of the audit problem pretty easily. The second thing that it does is it displaces the fossil fuel. Sorry, when you see 10% SAF, right? Like it's 10% of the good fuel and 90% of the fossil fuel. And as long as that's considered sustainable, you can buy some offsets. You're going to end up with more fossil fuels, right? So what we tell sustainability customers is that when you buy our credits, it's going to be 100%. When you fly, let's say you bought some credits. When you fly, you get your traditional carbon credits. So if you actually fly for work, your company gets a credit, not has to offset it. And then you can even sell the credits if you don't fly as much as the credits that you bought, right? So there's a whole market. And then of course, we want to export these credits, right? The way that we export LNG or oil and gas or iron, why can't we sell credits to, there's an international standard of carbon credits, the Kyoto Protocol. So we should certainly be able to sell credits as Australians. One team is sort of doing something similar. They're trying to figure out how to get this power line to New Zealand to sell our solar, but that's like you got to build a power line, right? With the credits, you're just selling productivity. You're like selling a stock in effect. I think selling the credits is easier than selling actual assets. So that's what's one thing he does. You move from assets to selling productivity that's green. So we have this sort of comparison table, which I sort of walked through, but there's no emissions, right? With the zero emissions flight credit, when you buy a SAF thing, or if your company buys SAF when you get on the plane, half of the fuel, or if not 90% of it's still going to be fossil fuels. So you're still going to be emitting stuff. Even if you had 100% SAF, you still have some carbon emissions because it's still carbon that you're combusting and putting back into the atmosphere. So it's about a 9% net reduction. So when you say like net zero, like zero means zero. It's not actually zero. Does it displace fossil fuels? Yeah, you're not using SAF or fossil fuels to fly. The important thing is that you're actually supporting the vehicle production, right? So when you buy a SAF credit, you're not paying for Qantas to get a plane that's 100% SAF. They're just dropping some in, right? But if this, you're actually paying for the vehicle. So, and then is it profitable? So I think you can do what NetJets does and sort of charter it out to economy travelers when you're not using it and make it profitable. But I think it can be profitable, whereas with a carbon credit or an offset, you just it's like a tax. You just lose the money, right? And you get a rate of return, right? So this is a distribution channel I think that we're actively pursuing. We talked to Austrade and we submitted something to the DCEEW, I think about. So someone at the government has to like do the paperwork to say we can sell this. But yeah, I think that the carbon offset spend is about 800 million a year. And if you spent that on green vehicles and infrastructure instead of planting a tree, I think you would get a lot further than just buying offsets. So that's the yeah. So anyways, that's so to answer your question, yes, Evelyn, that's a product that we're pursuing.
That's interesting, Jonathan. We should talk more because there's carbon offsets and there's carbon offsets. So the pricing looks very different for avoidance, what this would be versus the carbon removal offset.
Yeah,
it's not really offsets. It's like the carbon credit market. It has the offsets and then it has the removals. So that's an interesting space.
Just like any retailer, there's a premium version and there's a discount version. So the offset's the discount version. There's people who will do direct carbon capture. That's around 400. So the discount is I think it's like $33 for carbon credit today. That's the discount.
Oh, the price is very a lot. Yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah.
The carbon capture where you actually put it in the ground and take it out the air is $400
or more.
I think or more per ton, right?
Yeah.
So this would be in that premium end. And some people are buying SAF because they have the profit margin to do so, right? They want to do better than just offsetting. So the premium people who have the companies who have the income to do it, they want the premium. You might see when Bill Gates flies, he says, I paid for DAC credits, not the offsets, right? So it's just, you're absolutely right. And it makes me excited because I think it's something that would really, really work well for Australia. But you're absolutely right.
I guess I need to think about this more and maybe read what some other people are thinking about it. But because aviation is so hard to decarbonize, I feel like it would still be an avoidance credit, but maybe you could argue that it should be the absolute upper end of avoidance credits because it's something that's so difficult to decarbonize and you could try and maximize that value. But we can talk more about that on another day. Absolutely.
Anyone else? Do you guys believe in Melbourne to Sydney high-speed rail? I'm going to volunteer one. Or military procurement. That's awfully controversial these days. Anyone for military procurement? Okay, I can't see everyone, so let me. Military procurement. All right, we'll do military procurement, then we'll try to finish up with high-speed rail. So this applies mostly to us Americans. I think David may have seen some of these slides before because he's in the Air Force, but so apologies, David. But yeah, I think after the Cold War, we know that a lot of the military-industrial complex procures a lot of things, and it functions well. It's kept the world order for a long time. But I think at Boeing, the tanker controversy, if you guys remember that, was quite caused some introspection. And even with the tanker now and the Air Force project, you sort of see this drag on and on and on and on. So what the military started doing, what we participated in at, I think it was Dayton, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was they said we want dual use technologies. So we want something that works in the commercial sphere and in the military sphere. We don't want to just buy a dedicated military thing. And they're right to do that. So we just graphed, this is what I did, some work I did in Germany, but I just graphed in terms of empty weight, the weight of a plane that the military would buy in the same weight of a civilian plane. And then I asked, what does it actually cost the R&D versus the revenue that the company is getting, right? So the Predator drone family, it weighs about the same as a light sport aircraft. And it has some special avionics, but it costs about 5 times more. The Air Force pays about 5 times more for those planes than you and I would pay for a light sport aircraft. So maybe two times more or 1.5 times more might be necessary for the avionics and the disassembly to put it on a thing, but 5 times more is a little bit crazy. So same principle with the zero emissions fuel credits. Can we actually sell readiness to the military the way you might sell zero emissions flight to a company? So we looked, and I think, well, yes. So if you see the civilian aircraft, they're around here. So when Qantas buys a jet, it's about this cost, and when you buy a cargo plane, that's the same price. A military cargo plane, it's a bit higher, right? So the Predator one is kind of the most egregious one, but anyways, you can see why the military would try to, with procurement reform, insist on dual use, meaning civilian use and non-civilian use. So we said, okay, great. Cargo flights in the military, U.S. military, take up a lot. I think it's like $5 billion a year. David can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but it's an absurd amount of fuel that the U.S. military spends on cargo flights, and they want to reduce this. They just did a blended wing body design to do this, and they're sort of making that dual use, right? So we said, okay, what about the C-130? So that was for the C-17, the larger one. So C-130, it actually weighs about the same as a Virgin or a Qantas, single aisle aircraft, or a little bit less. It flies a bit slower, but it takes about the same. Sorry, it takes about the same payload, right? So, but as you know, you get on a Qantas plane, you're probably scrunched, or a Jetstar plane, right? Whereas you need to have these huge doors to be able to do a cargo flight. You got to take off on a short distance. So, but if we just take the most constraining requirement, so the heaviest payload, the biggest payload cross section, could we make a plane that does the job of the commercial flight, the sort of commercial freight, and also the military freight? So long story short, I won't give to the whole, we presented this to the Air Force in Dayton, but the long story short is we used a blended wing body to do this. And we found out a couple of things. So one, the power that you install is what changes, right? So a blended wing body is a wing and a fuselage blended together. So you've got a huge payload section, and they're very efficient for the volume that they carry. So we actually found that you could operate a blended wing body and a military civilian freight, which has to fly faster than a military cargo plane. So Mach 0.7 versus Mach 0.5 for about a third of the cost of a C-130 operating cost. So C-130 has to take off in very short distances. It's got 4 engines. It's very, I would say, fuel inefficient for what it's carrying. Now you definitely need more power to make a blended wing body take off in that same distance. And you could have the same amount of range. Now, if you try to make it work for us flying from Melbourne to Sydney as a commercial plane, you have to have even more power because those planes fly really fast and they fly 5-6 times a day. I think the Jetstar plane from Avalon it leaves at 6 a.m. and it doesn't stop flying till 11 p.m., right? And it's just going back and forth as many times as possible to make as much revenue as possible. So we couldn't actually beat the price. So they're getting $9 a nautical mile. That version was $11, but we were definitely able to do a blended wing body that had $9 a nautical mile that was going to be cheaper than a Airbus freighter that Qantas would use for the Aussie Post stuff. And it would be definitely cheaper to operate than the C-130. The other thing that we found is that the business community needs this too, right? So if we just did one market, like if you just swapped out the old C-130, and I should say this was also by using LNG, right? So LNG had the shale drilling, so big part of the assumptions there. But if you were to just replace the production of C-130s, you would get a 1% rate of return. Like if you guys have a mortgage, it's probably around 4 to 8%, right? So someone could just give money to the bank to lend out for mortgages and make more money. That's how investors decide what they're going to do something. So just making a cargo plane isn't profitable. And so you can see why if you're OEM selling to the Air Force, you might have a delay or two to get more money out of them, right? You have an incentive to sort of make back this investment. Now, if you are also selling to military cargo and you have that volume, 54 planes a year, you could get about 16%. That's pretty good. And if you could do all three, you could get it to 28%, right? So we actually found out the center body size is going to be what determines it. So a smaller center body is great for the civilian one because you can have less drag and fly faster. A fatter one is great for the military one. So then you have to go and talk to all three markets and see, would you guys say yes to this? And we did. We didn't succeed with the Australian Air Force. But anyways, on paper, you would have to have all three to have a business case. But having just one of them, you don't have a business case at all, right? And no innovation happens. So we think that doing a dual use aircraft is a great way to one, fix military procurement, have procurement reform, but it's also a great way to do the energy transition. And then what you would sell is that same credit, right? You'd sell the aircraft plus the fuel plus the infrastructure. So if your aircraft took up too much fuel, the company would be on the hook for buying that fuel. And if the Air Force didn't like it, they could just stop buying the credits, and then it'd be on the company to go do something else. So you have an incentive to make sure your customer's happy before and after they receive the product. So that's what we call a wet lease, similar to a wet lease, not quite the same, but it's similar. And that's sort of how Virgin is working with Qatar Airways now. So I think these are some things we can apply to military procurement, but basically procure readiness and then design a plane that has a civilian market and a military market with the most constraining requirements from each, and you could probably get a lot of new industrial base and new products out that way.
Thanks, Jonathan.
All right.
We've got 2 more minutes for questions, so I don't think we're going to have time for the rail case. I do have to go in a few minutes as well, but I would love to give another minute or 2 if anybody has any last comments or questions for Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's been an interesting presentation.
Thanks.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I'll just say thank you to everyone and stay tuned. There'll be some.
I had a question. Could I just?
Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead,
well, 2 questions. First, a quick one. The $2 per kilogram. Why is the unit per kilogram? I mean per weight rather than
Oh, so that's an arbitrary decision. It could be per milliliter, but this is normalized to the energy content and the efficiency. So it's normalized to mission energy. The reason I used it is because that's what everybody else uses. That's what everyone will recognize. So they didn't say $2 per megajoule or per BTU. They just said per kilogram. It would have been pounds in the US. I don't know, but yeah, it's an arbitrary measurement, but it's all on an equal mission. So the fuel cell is about 40% efficient. The jet engine is closer to 30%. So we factor that all in here. But yeah, this is on a mission equivalent energy basis.
So it does include the basically the scaling for the energy output.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. And my other question was in terms of disruptive innovations, the example of e-books and e-readers, does that count and so on? And I don't even know in terms of whether that counts as a success now or whether it's plateaued. So, and I mean, I'm thinking in terms of the criteria, whether it is a new market or whether really it is just the old, people who read or so on. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, the e-reader example is one that they typically use, and they use it in 59 tool, but that's when they typically use to teach it. So the hard part about this is figuring out what's the right basis of competition that would get someone new to start using this product. So with the e-readers, you measure it in kilograms you need per word, right? Or words you can put on per kilogram. So if you start with the 10 commandments that was carved into stone, you'd have a lot of very few words per kilogram. And then if you got to books in the printing press, you'd have a few more words per kilogram. And then if you got to the e-reader, you could have infinite words per kilogram, right? And because the e-reader is lighter, then new people might start reading. And if you're like me and you're an audio person, you probably didn't start reading till you had Audible and you could just listen to the books on the way to work, right? So that's even 0 kilogram. So the disruptive and the metric is like what's kind of hard to pin down and it's subjective, but yeah, the e-reader definitely disrupted, and that's why we have the iPad, right? So even Steve Jobs said we copied the Kindle, but we're going to make an iPad, and now, people who weren't going to take their laptop somewhere and they take an iPad somewhere, or they, so yeah. And you can kind of see, and the e-readers and iPads are great examples, right? So as the e-reader, it didn't have color, but maybe you didn't need color, but now it had color, right? And as soon as it had color, got some more memory, now you can surf the internet. So it got good at things you can't do with a normal book. And then in some cases, people just started reading from their tablets or their computers before, and they're no longer buying books. So I think Amazon is a classic. Even before that, if you just think about buying books, just Amazon disruption of Borders and Barnes and Nobles. Like whoever thought Barnes and Nobles managed to have those huge stores, and whoever thought anyone could beat them, right? And Amazon used to say, "We have a warehouse so big you can't be at a mall," right? A to Z. That was their commercial. I remember when they started, right? So yeah, that's a great example, and definitely agree it's a disruptive innovation.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jonathan, when you think about it, because there's still some people who prefer real books, or for me, I actually like reading on my Kindle, and I keep the internet turned off because when I'm reading, I actually don't want to be seeing my emails and things. So it's interesting to think about different markets or how you can kind of maybe innovate so far and then go in a different direction. That's a really good example. We are over time now, so we will draw this talk to a close now. And thank you so much, Jonathan, for the talk today and for all of your participation in our events. Do stay tuned. I'll be announcing our next talk and also the next quarterly coffee soon. And if anybody else would like to volunteer and give one of our virtual talks this year, I do still have a couple of spaces available, so please send me an email. And we'll see everybody at the next event. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.